So we are going to talk about chapter 12, which is all about food. So if you're hungry, not this picture obviously, but we've got some good pictures of food coming up later. And let's get started. Okay, so one thing about food is that the reason we eat it is because it gives us nutrients, right? Well, that's the exact same reason that bacteria and fungus are going to eat it too. And I know that sounds obvious, but a lot of people don't even think about that that's why these bacteria and fungi grow on these foods, is because they are nutritious, and that's also why we eat them. So it's no surprise that the microbes eat them, and that literally is what food spoilage is. If we could take a food product and stop its enzymes. Okay, so let's say, for example, we're going to take some meat and cook it to stop the enzymes in that food, and it would also be sterile, then there would be no way that that thing could break down. So if you put it in a vacuum, where they suck all the air out, and therefore no bacteria or fungi could live in there, if they could make it sterile, vacuum it, shut down the enzymes, the food would never break down. Okay? So it really is those microbes that are doing all of the rotting, so to speak, or spoiling of food. Okay? Like I said, yes, there are some internal enzymes in a food item that are going to help rot it from the inside, but those aren't terribly active. Most of your food rot, or spoiling, or going bad, all those terms just refer to the work of microbes doing what they normally do. Okay? So food is a really big deal, and these numbers are kind of crazy. So 1/3 of the food that is made is simply thrown away, and that makes me so angry. So everything in orange here is everything that gets thrown away of all the food that we make. The reason that makes me so angry is because some farmer grew it, or rancher raised it. Somebody had to harvest that food or kill the animal and process it. It had to go on the store shelf. Somebody had to put it on the shelves. And then 1/3 of that food that makes it to the shelves just gets thrown away. And how many more people could we feed if that wasn't happening? And only 20% of that, so this little small triangle of the larger triangle, is because it was spoiled. So yes, bacteria and fungi do get rid of a lot of the food, but not the majority of it. So the rest of this orange triangle is simply going to be things like, well, it was put out on the buffet and we're not allowed to serve it the next day, so we have to throw it away. Okay, or I ate at a restaurant and I don't like leftovers, so I'm just going to let them throw away whatever food I don't finish. Or a kid who has a bowl of cereal and eats the cereal and then throws away the leftover milk. Okay, that's what the majority of that is. So there's still a lot of that, but it's still this little triangle here is still a big enough problem. We work really hard to reduce the amount that is actually thrown away. Okay, so this chapter is going to help us identify the factors that cause food spoilage, so what makes it go faster or slower, and then look at the effects of food spoilage on the different food types. So, exactly what does it do when it spoils meat? And is that a problem? Could it make us sick? And then 12.3, discuss the 5 methods used for food preservation, and a very short comment on the challenges for food safety today. And the homework for this chapter, I'm actually going to send you guys on some more, a few scavenger hunts. You're going to have to go through your house and find some stuff. You're going to have to go to at least 3 websites to find some information there. I'm trying to get you guys more engaged in the homework rather than just having it be easy little point-and-click homeworks. Although I will say even the homework scores have not been great. I really feel like you guys have to dig in harder if you're going to learn this information and pass the class. Okay? All right, so let's get into it. 12.1, food spoilage. So the term spoilage just means the food going bad so that we don't like it anymore. So that could mean anything from a dangerous pathogen being in there to simply not tasting good anymore. might not be harmful to us. You know, there are some bacteria we'll talk about called lactic acid bacteria, and they produce an acidic flavor. And that doesn't mean that it's going to hurt you. It just means it's not going to taste good. Okay? So sometimes the spoilage can cause bad growth of microbes that we don't want. And sometimes the food spoilage is just going to make it smell and taste not very good. Okay? And it's hard to know which is which, and that's why we always will throw something out when it tastes bad. But that is also why we can definitely eat a pathogen without knowing it. It's not like they have to go together. Okay? Make sure that you understand that as we're going through this discussion. You can have bad taste doesn't always mean pathogen, but it sometimes does, right? That's the problem. We throw things out when they taste bad, but we also have to just be careful with everything because it could have a pathogen and taste totally fine. Okay, one really good example of that is when something like lettuce or spinach gets contaminated with salmonella. You can't taste that. It's not going to taste like anything. It's going to be just fine to eat, and you won't know about it until a few hours later when you start feeling sick. All right, so anyway, in the past, we used to use spices to preserve the food and also to kind of hide those bad flavors. So we can't use spices to hide pathogens. That's not going to work. But we can use the spices to mask the bad flavors and really to prevent the pathogens from landing there in the first place. Okay. All right, these little categories here on this graph will show you how much waste we have in different categories. So obviously more fruits and vegetables because, I mean, frankly, they're usually cheaper. They can often perish sooner than the other categories do. All right, so when we are buying our food, we are going to be looking for safe food, right? And manufacturers of food do have criteria that they need to follow to make sure that the food that they're giving us is safe. Okay, so they have inspections that make sure the food is safe, but it's not as though every load of milk that comes out of a factory is tested by somebody else. Okay, so these label dates are the company's best recommendation for when you should buy that milk or bread, or when you should use it, or when it's going to taste best. Okay, each of those means something different, don't they? The sell-by date says to the store, you need to sell this item by this date, and then they know the average amount of time that somebody's going to keep that product before they use it. So if, for example, the sell-by date is November 15th, then they know that somebody's probably going to finish it by the end of December. Okay, so they're trying to tell the store, you got to sell this by this date. We're going to send you more. We want it to taste good. The best by date is totally arbitrary. This is just when is it going to taste best by. So it really has nothing to do with microbial load or anything like that. For example, you might have pasta with a best by date that's like 3 years from now, but pasta will last virtually forever without any microbial contamination. It might just kind of taste a little stale. Get a like stale cereal. Pasta can do that too. It just takes a really long time. Okay, so those ones are pretty arbitrary. And then the use by date is, you might see that more on milk. Like, use it by this date because we know when we gave it to the store, we know you're probably going to buy it within 2 weeks or a month of it being in the store. And we know after you open it, it's going to last about this long. Okay, but really those aren't regulated. So one milk company might put theirs out at 2 weeks, somebody else for 3. A bread company might have theirs for 1 month or 2 months. It's arbitrary. But why do you think that they would want to use those? Why would stores even, why wouldn't they say it's good for longer? Because then you might keep it for longer and get more use out of it. There are 2 really big reasons. Does anybody want to pipe in, talk, or type in the chat? Why do you think that stores, they don't have to put those dates on there? Why don't those dates last longer? And we actually do lose a lot of food to these dates because people and stores will throw them out if those dates are passed. Why do we want to do that? I mean, why do manufacturers want to put those dates on there? Somebody give me a reason. How about, will somebody give me a reason if I give you an extra credit point on your next homework assignment? Take down a note. One extra credit point on your homework assignment if you give me a reason why a company would want to use these dates. They don't have to. There you go. Extra credit's always a good motivator. Yeah, they will make more money, but how? Tell me more.
So the consumer will buy more?
Yeah, right? If you have a use by date that's a week past, you're like, oh shoot, I gotta throw this out and go buy some new ones. So of course the companies want to do that. So you should take those dates with a grain of salt. I always tell my students, I mean my children, like if they check the milk and it's expired, I always tell them smell it first, because if it doesn't smell, it's probably fine. Now if it's been like, you know, a month over, yeah, sure. But if it's a few days, no way. A week, nah. Especially if it's been closed for most of that time. Like if you opened it once, poured out a glass of milk and closed it back up tight and then forgot about it in the back of the fridge, it's just a few days over, it's most likely fine. Especially if it's a sell by date, because they already know you're going to have that for much longer than the date that it's supposed to leave the store. Okay? All right, so thanks for the comment. There's another reason too, actually. Maybe I think of another reason. This one's a little bit sneakier. It's also about making money, by the way, because that's the only reason a company would do something that they don't have to. You may have a different idea. What about if they put their use by or best by or sell by date too long and their product does start to degrade, you might go back to that dry cycles and the date still be good and it just doesn't taste as good, right? So their best by date should be at a time when it still tastes good to you, right? There might not be a pathogen in there. There might not be anything wrong with the food. If it doesn't taste as good, you're not going to be as likely to buy that product. Right? Does that make sense? So that can be the other reason why they have those dates on certain items. Okay, so we spent a lot of time about that, but that's kind of a consumer knowledge information that I think is important. Okay, so the shelf life is a little bit more specific. It is the length of time that food can be safely stored. And this can be pretty important for more canned goods. Like those are the ones that have a really long shelf life, right? They will still have a date on them. So that one is like, how long can it stay on the shelf? So it's a longer time frame than the label date, okay? And if your food is sterile when they put it in the can, or if it's something like pasta that's totally dry, then the chance of microbial growth is very small and the date will be far, far into the future, okay? All right, but this all comes down to microbial load and really trying to reduce that in a safe way. And so we have usually very low numbers of microbes in our food, but there are definitely times when lots of microbes are totally fine. And that's a little disconcerting because even in milk, there's a certain number of microbes that are allowed to be in there. But if it's something like probiotic bacteria, you want tons of microbes in there, because those are good bacteria that's going to help your digestive system. Okay, so the microbial load usually has to be low, and most companies have to monitor that themselves and make sure that the product that they're putting out is safe. Because like I said, there's nobody that is testing the milk in the store, for example, unless they're doing it as part of a investigation. All right. So let's talk about where the contamination can come from. So contamination of our food products can come from the air, the soil, or the water, wherever that thing was growing, if it's a plant, or living, if it was an animal. So there's no way to guarantee that something that grows outside is going to be contamination free. That's ridiculous, because contaminants can come in through the air, just floating from one field to another, or in runoff, in water, or the soil that goes with it. And even things like the food that we grow can have botulism in it. And botulism is deadly in most cases. And so our food, we should assume that when we first pick it or kill it, it is going to be contaminated to some degree. So then our strategy is just to control or minimize that contamination. Okay, so with proper handling, we can control most of those, right? Foodborne illnesses are not terribly common, and certainly not terribly deadly as long as we do things correctly. Animal feces are another one, and that can be contamination like in this chicken house here, or it can even be from cattle, for example, and their feces are used for fertilizer on a spinach field. Okay, that could be another source of contamination. So animal feces contaminating animals, or animal feces contaminating vegetables, as an example. And then we can also have pathogens or toxins that are specific to different animals. One of the categories that this is really important for is the shellfish or other fish, because they have to, some of them anyway, will filter their water, and that's how they eat. So they can accumulate the toxins in their bodies. So if you've ever been to the coast when there's a red tide, you'll see signs everywhere about not eating the shellfish because they're contaminated with the bacteria from the red tide. Okay, so that's a good example if you've traveled to Florida or Georgia or Alabama on the coast and on the Gulf side, you've probably seen those warnings frequently. And the last one then, of course, is rodents and insects. They can carry diseases on their bodies, or not so much as the biting insects here, although that is one, but really we're just talking about being exposed to the rodents having access to the food and carrying bacteria on their body as they're walking across the food. Oh shoot, I was going to say something else here. Oh yeah, so in case you didn't know, there is an allowable amount of insect and other non-target species that are allowed in your food. So when they test food for safety purposes, they will test to see how many non-target organisms are there. So for example, if you're eating a hot dog, and we always pick on hot dogs for this, there's a certain amount allowable of insect and other species that are allowed to be in there. And it can be disturbingly high just because of the difficulty with keeping things 100% pure when they're going through the food system. It's almost impossible. All right, so now we're going to talk about the factors that encourage or discourage microbes from attacking your food. Okay, so we can split those up into two different types of factors, intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So the intrinsic ones are conditions that are naturally present in the foods. So they're going to be different for different foods, right? And we'll talk about those different types of factors. And then there are extrinsic factors, and the main one there really is temperature. Are you keeping it at the proper temperature to slow down the microbes? Let's look at those on the next couple of pages here. Okay, so the intrinsic factors are things like, what is the water content of the food? By now, you should clearly understand that microbes like a high water content because their bodies are mostly made of water, so they need that around them. So if you have foods like milk or cucumbers or grapes or soup, anything like that that naturally has a lot of moisture content, that is going to spoil very quickly. Whereas foods like pasta and flour, as long as they don't get wet, bacteria have no reason to grow there, and so they simply won't. Okay, so they will spoil less quickly. pH is another one, and so a lot of bacteria like to live on a neutral pH. Same with fungus too. Almost everything likes a neutral pH, close to 7. But there are some that don't like acidic areas. So bacteria, for example, don't like acidic areas. And so our lemons and limes will be less likely to be infected with bacteria. Now, you know that lemons and limes are likely to rot, though. But that's usually fungus. There are some fungi that can attack acidic fruits. The next one is the physical structure. So here we can see two examples with meat, although it would be the same thing for any food item. If it is whole and intact, then it's less likely to rot because there's less surface area for all that bacteria to get to. As soon as we start slicing it and grinding it and chopping it, it's more easy for the bacteria to start invading all of those little tiny surface areas. The same thing's even true for lettuce, right? If you get an intact head of lettuce, it is less likely to rot than a shredded bag with all those open ends for the bacteria to start working on. And then the chemical composition is referring to how easy it is for certain things to be nutritious to bacteria or not. Okay, so for example, if an item has a lot of protein or fat, bacteria are going to like that and they're going to be able to grow more easily on that item. And if it is, I don't know, like full of carbohydrates, and the bacteria can't live on the carbohydrate if it's a species of bacteria that can't do that as well. Okay. The next type then is the extrinsic factors. So in other words, how we are taking care of the food from the outside. So if something is refrigerated, it's going to slow down the microbes, and that's better for not spoiling it as quickly. And then I also put in contact with other items. This one was not in your book, so make sure that you understand this one. But there are the intrinsic factors that they have themselves, and you know, they will have their own. Food has its own bacterial load that it comes with, and so the intrinsic factors take into account the fact that they have their own bacteria, and you know, if their chemical composition is wrong, or they are sliced up, or they are not the right pH, then we're more likely to be contaminated. But I'll give you an example for this contact with other items. Let's say, for example, you have a banana or an apple. Let's do an apple. And its skin is intact. There's not any nicks in it. You should be able to keep that in the fridge for an incredibly long time. But what happens if it sits on the shelf next to your ground beef and some of the juice from the ground beef came into contact with the apple? For the ground beef, that might not be such a big deal because you can cook it and make sure that you're going to kill the pathogens. But for the apple that was not previously exposed to those bacteria, does not have any intrinsic factors that are a problem, its contact now with that contamination is going to more quickly cause it to become spoiled. Okay, for one thing, it's now sitting in juice, so it's going to be even more liquidy than it was before, and this juice came off the ground beef and probably has some pathogens on it. Okay, so both of those would be extrinsic or external factors that can affect food spoilage. All right. So this is just a little bit of a review here that, you know, these words that you probably already know. There are some foods that are highly perishable, and we need to be more careful with them. And most people are very comfortable with what those are. You know, milk, fish will spoil much more quickly than other meats just because of the way that its chemical structure is and the amount of moisture, the amount of bacteria in the gills. So it is higher on the list than some other meats. Okay? So you can kind of think of it as like up here at the top along with milk. And these other meats are lower, little less perishable. But all of that stuff is way more perishable than these semi-perishable things. For example, that bread, even though it's dry, fungus will love it. Fungus loves starches. And so fungus is what's going to take over your breads, even your potatoes, maybe as your potatoes get dried out. Even, you know, a fungus could even live there. But what all these other ones have in common is that they are more moist, and that's going to make them. Still perishable, even if their pH isn't very friendly to microbes. Okay. And then there are some things that will last just a really long time. They might not taste the best after years. Like, you know, coffee can kind of lose some of its flavor if it gets old, but it's probably not going to grow any microbes because it's dry. All those non-perishable things are dry. Okay. I think this one is supposed to be like a can of soup, maybe, that is completely sterile when it's put into the container, and so it should be able to last virtually forever. Okay, so now we're switching gears and we're going to talk about how the foods are affected by the microbes. And I do want you to know some of these microbes. The ones I want you to know are in your notes. And so some of them you're going to see up here, and I haven't put them in your notes, but you can see all those italicized words are all microbes. So just know the ones that are in your notes. Okay. So in this section, we're going to talk about each of the different groups of food and kind of talk about their common issues with spoilage. Okay, so first off, we're talking about meat, and that includes seafood. I know some people say meat and seafood, but seafood is a type of meat, so whatever. All of that is high in protein and fat, and so it can, there's a large variety of microbes that like that. So bacteria, yeast, remember yeast are fungi, and then molds are actually protists. So all of those three types of microbes, except viruses, right? We're never going to talk about viruses here in this chapter because viruses aren't going to be infecting our dead food. Okay, viruses need a living host to replicate them, and so there won't be a problem for us to worry about them on our food. All right, anyway, so the other categories of bacteria, fungi, and protists can grow on meat because it is so nutritious. And we've already talked about how the grinding of meat increases that surface area. But you know, meat really should be pretty sterile when it's inside of an animal, right? When you are a fish or a cow, your innards should be sterile enough, at least the meat part, right? The muscle that we use from the animal should be sterile. So the problem comes after, you know, during the processing of the meat, and because we have to handle it so often. Okay, so that's the key to keeping your meat fresh, and therefore the longer it has to be shipped, the more trouble it's going to have, right? Because it's going to be shipped for longer, more people handling it. Buy local meat is the answer there. Okay, so a couple of the microbes that are a problem with meat are the lactic acid bacteria. And those ones are they're called that because they produce lactic acid. And that, by the way, is the same thing that your muscles make when they work too hard. It's just a byproduct of fermentation. Okay, so these microbes are just doing that natural thing that your muscles do as well. But these are bacteria doing it. So when they produce too much lactic acid, it's going to turn the meat an off color. So it's going to be more brownish colored, look kind of bland and not bright red. And the surface of the meat will be slimy and it won't smell very good, although it's not going to be so bad that you think, oh, I don't want to eat this, unless it's really bad, really infected with the lactic acid bacteria. And some meat producers will add red color to their meat to hide this, because the lactic acid bacteria aren't going to make you sick, but they know that it's going to make the meat look less good, and so they add red color to it. So again, buy local, because your local farmers probably aren't going to be doing that. All right, so how about processed meats? Here we can see a lot of lunch meats in the picture, hot dogs, things like that. So meat that no longer looks as much, you know, it's never going to be whole. That's why we call it processed meat. So those have to be handled even more. Whatever we did to grind them or slice them, we have to keep that area very, very clean. And then because they are ground and processed so much, we will often be adding preservatives to them. So they might be salted, they might have nitrites or nitrates, which are like waste products that bacteria don't like to live in. So the bacteria, for example, would make nitrites or nitrates, and then die off because they're living in their own waste. So sometimes we'll add those to meat so it's a less friendly environment. Kind of gross, right? And then we have all sorts of other preservatives we can add to these meats to help their shelf life be extended. Okay. Now, fermented meats are interesting. Fermented meats are tasty, right? Things like salami. But they're kind of gross when you think about them, because what happens with these fermented meats is that you purposefully let the microbes ferment the meat, which just means live off of the meat, and that is the way that they're preserved. But through that process, the other pathogens can't live there. So something like salami is actually raw meat that has been fermented by the microbes. Okay? And then because it is fermented in that proper way, just like a fermented drink can't have pathogens in it, that fermented salami can't have pathogens in it either, as long as that process is done correctly. Okay, so it sounds kind of weird, like raw meat that you purposely let the bacteria grow on, and then what we have is this salami at the end of it, but that's how that works. At least the real. You know, these days they can take meat and process it in a way so that it tastes like the real fermented salami, but it's not the real fermented salami. So anyway, something to look into if you prefer your meats to be more original, so to speak. All right. Anyway, listeria can be an issue with things like cold cuts. Okay, so that's an important one to know. All right, next is poultry and eggs. Now, eggs are sterile when they're laid. When they come out of that chicken, they are sterile, and they have this covering on the shell that helps them to maintain their sterility. And that's why, you know, a lot of people here still do that. You know, in the big cities where people always buy just store-bought eggs, you can't do this because those store-bought eggs are washed really well, and then they have to stay refrigerated because they've lost that protective covering. If you have your own chickens, you know that you can leave the chicken eggs sitting out on the counter for quite a while because of that protective coating that you're not washing off. But at any rate, the contamination can come from anything on those chickens. Those chicken houses are not the cleanest places. Chickens aren't the cleanest birds, and so we can have a lot of contamination there. This egg, I forget what this was, the Proteus, I think, it causes that black mark on the inside of the egg. And kind of creates like a sulfury smell when it grows. And the Serratia, this is an interesting bacteria, the Serratia marcescens. Well, actually, if you've ever had like a pinkish tinged, what's it called, like shower scum, that's Serratia marcescens as well. It grows really well around people, but it leaves a reddish tinge. And so if you've ever seen that in your eggs, that not the blood tinge when there's a little extra, you know, like blood fluid in your eggs, but I mean, it's not harmful usually as long as your health system's okay. But that's kind of an interesting bacteria that we use a lot in a microbiology lab. So it's fun to watch it be red all the time. But of course, Salmonella is probably the most well-known egg contaminant. Okay, so we'll talk about seafood in its own category. I know it is a meat, but it deserves its own category because of how highly perishable it is. Fish does not last long at all, and freezing it really breaks down a lot of fish textures that we like. So seafood is especially problematic. So the water temperature is an issue because most fish live in cool water, and so we will find that the bacteria that live on them is perfectly happy to be refrigerated. Okay, and because they're constantly drinking that water through their gills, as that's their method of breathing, their gills can load up on bacteria as well. And I don't need you to know all of these different species here, but I do want you to definitely know that different species of microbes live in warm water compared to cold water. Okay, so the fish that come from warm waters have different microbes than the fish that come from cold waters. And obviously those colder water microbes are going to be happy to be refrigerated. So you often know that getting fish, ocean fish here in Kentucky can be a problem because it's got to be shipped. If it's frozen, it might lose some texture. So we tend to move fish very quickly through the food processing stages. Okay, shellfish is especially a problem because of what I mentioned before with them filter feeding. That's how they eat their food, is by filtering the water through them and capturing everything that's in it. So they can be very susceptible to contamination. And so they will often be attempted to be kept alive until they're processed. If you kill it and then let it sit there for 2 weeks, that's when the really bad contamination is going to occur. If you can ship it alive and then cook it right before it's sold or eaten, then your contamination probably is not going to be a problem. As you can see, there are some pretty severe side effects from the microbes that can attack shellfish, so it's nothing to mess around with. The next category is milk and dairy products. And milk is especially good for microbes because it meets all the criteria that we need it to. It's a liquid, it has a neutral pH, its chemical composition is high fat, and its physical characteristics, it's a liquid, so it's perfectly great for microbes to live in. And so you often know that milk is one of the first things to go in your fridge when you're talking about food spoilage. We do have lactic acid bacteria there. Milk's not one of those that's usually going to cause too many problems for you as far as pathogens, but it will lose its flavor very quickly because of those lactic acid bacteria. And then the problem with cheese is a weird thing because we use microbes to make cheese. That is how cheese is made, is that we purposefully introduce the microbes to it or to yogurt to make them the consistency that we want them to be. So we know they're a very friendly medium for these microbes to grow on, and the longer that they sit, the more microbes that will find their way in there. So if you keep a sealed cheese wrapped up, it's going to last much longer than one that's been unwrapped even just once, because they're so friendly to microbes. I'll tell you a little story about making cheese. Years ago, my husband and I used to make cheese quite often, and we would make all sorts of soft cheeses like ricotta and like farmer's cheese and things like that. But we never got a hard cheese to work because of contamination. And I know about microbiology. I know how to keep things sterile. But I was doing it in my house, so it's very hard to truly keep it sterile. And so we would make the cheese and using bleach, the 5% bleach solution all the time on our hands, on everything that we put into contact with the cheese. We would even cover it up with the wax that is supposed to keep it even safer, or do the saltwater baths if the cheese called for that. Not once did we get a cheese to taste as good as what you buy in the store. So if you've ever been to a cheese factory, or even sometimes school groups will take a tour of like an Amish cheese barn, everybody's in full gowns and masks and everything because it is so hard to keep cheese sterile. So you should thank those cheese producers if you're a fan of cheese for always keeping their facilities so clean, because it's like the easiest thing in the world to get wrong. And I found that out firsthand. Okay, fruits and vegetables. So fruit there aren't a lot of bacteria that really like to go after fruit because of the amount of acidity in most fruits. Not all fruits are acidic, but a lot of them are. But otherwise, they do have good environments. Like, for example, strawberries, they go bad so fast, right? Because they have such a high moisture content. They're not as acidic as some. But for those ones that are acidic, molds are perfectly happy to take over. So the fungus will infect the acidic fruits and fruit. Like we see in this orange here, this one is covered in a green fungal mold. But yeast and bacteria in general will go after fruits, and especially fruit juice. Again, those lactic acid bacteria, those darn things, don't make you sick, but they will certainly make you not want to drink the juice. It's going to end up tasting acidic, but not in a good citrusy kind of way. in the rancid, ew, that tastes sour kind of way. Vegetables can also succumb to lactic acid bacteria, and also this soft rot. The soft rot is just the softening of tissues, so they're not going to have a growth that looks like this. They're just going to kind of get yucky and spongy, but that is a microbe that's doing that as well. And then molds can grow on vegetables as well, but we typically associate those with the fruits. All right, I think this is our last one for the food types. This is our grains, and they tend to be infected during growth. Okay, and I know we said that about a lot of different things, but the grains being infected during growth is where that contamination comes from, so that by the time you pick them, the damage is done. So this could be really these two main types, the aflatoxin and the bacteria that causes ergotism. Okay, so Claviceps purpurea causes ergotism, which can make you crazy. It's a neurotoxin, and it can make you act weird if you eat it. Now, the food processing processes don't allow that to occur anymore, but this has happened in the past, and at a time when people were starving and had to eat whatever was available. So you can see the ergot on here. It's this darkened area right here. And if you are desperate for food, then you will eat that part along with the rest. Okay, it was harder back then to weed it out and then to not have it when you're starving. But then the aflatoxin is kind of a building up type of a toxin that comes from this aspergillus. And so that can be on things like peanuts and soybeans. And so it's not too much of a problem for a meal or two, but if you're eating tons of that and it has the aflatoxin on it, then it can build up. And then as far as the bakery products go, this is the problem with baking of breads. So bacillus species can survive, bacillus spores I should say, can survive baking, because normally when you bake bread, you're going to kill anything that's in there. Well, the bacillus will come back out and start to do its damage again as soon as that bread is out of the oven and can get a little bit of moisture out of the air. Those spores can revegetate and start growing and cause some problems. Okay, so that is the bulk of the new information. I'm going to try to go through the rest of this information pretty quickly because we've learned all this already. This came from, what chapter was that? If you want to refresh on some of this. The controlling microbes, so the chapter 10. That's when we would have covered a lot of this. So this food preservation should sound very familiar to you. So when we are trying to preserve food, we're trying to just slow down the spoilage of the food. We know it's going to spoil eventually. So what can we do to extend that shelf life? And we have had methods over time of, salting fish or salting meat or adding spices to things. But what do we do these days to really get this under control? So we know that we can preserve our food by heat. Okay, we've talked about that already, and about protein denaturation, which is going to break down the protein structure so that the bacteria, for example, won't be able to live because we haven't denatured their protein. Same thing with pasteurization. That heat will ruin their proteins, ruin their cell membranes. We've already covered that, right? Some other heating methods are canning. That's why we can foods, is to heat them up and then take away the oxygen, because that's what the pathogens need. Commercial sterilization is an attempt to do something, this is very broad, but to do something to this food so that it is sterile. And that could be something like irradiation or just heating it up very quickly. And we're trying to even eliminate the endospores so that we could really extend that shelf life. And the last one is blanching. Blanching is, oftentimes we'll see that in a recipe as a way to quickly heat up a food and like maybe take the skin off a tomato, or blanch a vegetable so that it is still nice and crisp without being too cooked. We can use blanching to preserve things too. We're just trying to kill that organism so that its enzymes stop working, right? And maybe kill a few microbes as well. So this is some of those industrial methods for that. This is a milk pasteurizing vat that's going to heat up the milk to the exact proper temperature for the proper amount of time. And then canning, heat it up and put it in a can so it goes in sterile. We can also preserve things by keeping them cold. And that can either be refrigerating or freezing the thing. And obviously, we talked before about why we might want to refrigerate versus freeze things. One of the main reasons to do one or the other is because of what it's going to do to the texture of the food. So for example, nobody freezes a cucumber. Oh, that would be horrible. Because when you would unfreeze it, when you would let it thaw, the cells would all be burst apart and it would turn into mush. Okay, so we have to refrigerate a cucumber. But you might want to freeze something to make it stay even longer. Okay, so basil leaves, for example, will do fine in the fridge or the freezer. So if you want to keep them for a long time, you would freeze them. Right, that's the benefit there. There are, remember that the cold is not going to kill microbes, it's just going to slow them down. And we can dry foods, either by adding a material to it that will desiccate it, like salt or sugar, or we can freeze dry it, which means cool it down and pull out the water at the same time. And we have all these other preserving methods that we've talked about before as well. Salt or sugar to remove the water, that's the drying one. Or too much salt that the microbes can't survive. Okay, so we might not be removing the water, but we're adding so much salt that the microbes can't survive. Irradiation, this is how a lot of your international food will be attempted to be sterilized, is by irradiating it, so hitting it with gamma rays that will destroy the microbial DNA and any other DNA it comes into contact with. And then chemical preservatives, we can spray our food with preservatives to keep the microbial load down. And of course, as soon as it's re-exposed to the microbes, it's a perfectly happy environment. So this is a constant battle. The last one is a type of chemical preservative, but specifically the sulfites. Sulfur dioxide, not really chemical, it's kind of just a naturally occurring molecule, but that can control the microbes as well. All right, last slide. So this is the hazard analysis and critical control point. Okay, this is a food safety system that monitors our meats and identifies critical control points where we need to be careful of our food and how it's being handled at different stages in its processing. Okay, so this will be one of the areas that you guys will be researching when you go and do your homework. So be prepared for that. So I'll let you guys investigate that one a little bit on your own in the homework assignment. So the homework assignment's almost done. I just have a few more things to add to it, but you can look for that later on tonight. Okay? I talked fast, I'm sorry. But any questions about any of that or about the extra credit? Okay. All right, so I would highly recommend that you start the extra credit soon. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's going to be due next Friday on the 30th. Okay, so that gives you about a week and a half to do that. If you are, if you envision being really pressed on time for some reason, if you have projects and other classes due, just let me know. I'm happy to extend that deadline. I just don't want it to sit out there for so long that it becomes a useless activity. Okay. All right, well, you guys have a great week. Make sure that you are getting registered for spring classes and study hard. All right.